I've made a few tutorials about keyframe animation, but they've all involved animation on the keyframe controller of the effect. Vegas Pro version 23 introduced a handy new feature where keyframe animation can be carried out directly on the timeline. The big advantage of this is that the keyframes from multiple events with multiple animated enabled effects can be manipulated at the same time. There's no need to keep switching from one event's keyframe controller to another. This is going to be rather a long tutorial, so I ask for your patience. I'm going to make this particular demonstration quite simple because the capability of this feature is quite extensive. The first thing to note, as I said in the introduction, is that the feature is only available in version 23. By default it's disabled, so you have to enable it by going to the View menu and clicking the checkbox labelled Show OFX Effect Envelopes Beta. Timeline animation can be carried out at track level or event level. I'll first deal with track level effect animation. If the track effect icon isn't visible on the track header, you need to click the ellipses and click the Edit Visible Button Set option. On the dialog that opens, select Track Effects and click OK. I'll apply the black and white effect. Because the effect has been applied at track level, every event on that track will be affected. To apply track animation for this effect, one or more parameters of the effect has to have its animation enabled. For this effect, there's only one parameter. I can now close the UI. The two video events on the timeline have both previously been stabilized, indicated by the blue FX circles on the event thumbnails. If you've watched tutorial 131, you'll recognize the inverted chevrons on the colored part of the track header. Clicking this shows the effect or effects applied. This shows both the black and white effect and the stabilization effect. The latter is applied at event level, so I'll ignore that. If I click the Expand Keyframes chevrons for the black and white entry, the keyframe controller for the whole timeline opens. I call it the keyframe controller because it behaves much like the keyframe controller in the UI for an event effect. The track header shows information about the black and white effect. It shows the parameter to be animated, the default parameter value, the Add Keyframe icon, and the visibility icon. The Add Keyframe icon is color-coded, so that the keyframes for multiple parameters can be easily identified. The visibility icon simply hides the animation envelope for that particular parameter. That's quite useful if you have many animated parameters and you need to isolate most so that you can concentrate on just one. On the timeline keyframe controller, there's the effect parameter value envelope. In this case, there's only one parameter animated, so there's only one envelope. It will be positioned depending on the parameter default value, in this case at the top, which is equivalent to 1. The envelope can be manipulated by using keyframes, and I'll go through that process in the next section. Timeline animation for event effects is initiated in the same way as that for track effects animation, except that the effects are applied at event level. I'll apply a couple of effects to each of the events on the timeline. To demonstrate the capabilities of this feature, each event will have different effects applied. Bear with me while I do this. Now, without this new feature, I would have to switch between each event effect UI to animate their effects. Enabling this feature means that I can animate all enabled parameters directly on the timeline. To expose the timeline keyframe tracks, as mentioned previously, I click the two inverted chevrons on the coloured part of the track header. You will see that the event effects for the event under the playhead are shown, each with its own keyframe track. Placing the playhead over the other event shows its applied effects. You'll notice that, because each event has been stabilized, that track remains, showing all its keyframes. To expose the keyframe controller for an effect, click the chevrons at the side of its label. The timeline keyframe controller for that effect opens. You'll notice that the controller extends beyond the first event, showing the animation envelopes for the effects applied to the second event. The blend amount envelope for the black and white effect remains at 0 throughout the event. I can apply a keyframe at any point by simply right-clicking on the envelope and selecting Add Point. I can also add a keyframe by placing the playhead and clicking the Add Keyframe icon. There are three ways of specifying the parameter value at that keyframe. Right-click the keyframe and use the Set To option in the context menu. or drag the envelope after the keyframe up or down until the desired parameter value is shown in the label that appears. Or you can drag the keyframe up or down. The only problem with that method, as you may have noticed, is that it's very easy to move the keyframe along the timeline, and this may not be desirable. Another way to do it without moving the keyframe along the timeline is to hold the control key down while adjusting the keyframe height. The slope of the envelope between the keyframes indicates the default interpolation mode as linear. If you're not familiar with interpolation modes, I discussed them in detail in tutorial 126. I have to point out a bug that exists in build 356 and possibly build 302 concerning the default interpolation mode. The bug has been passed on to the developers. However, as the development of Vegas Pro has been taken over by Boris FX, it's highly unlikely that this bug will be fixed for version 23. Fortunately, there is a workaround for this, as I will explain. When you create a keyframe by using the right-click context menu Add Point option, the default interpolation mode is hold instead of linear. This can be shown in the animation of the blend amount. The preview should show the blend amount increasing until the next keyframe, where the preview will show full black and white. I'll play the animation to show what really happens. You see that the effect is only applied when the third keyframe is reached. This can be shown more clearly in the keyframe controller for the black and white effect. You can see from this that the interpolation mode of the second keyframe is hold, even though the timeline animation envelope shows linear. If, however, you create the keyframe using the Add Keyframe icon on the track header, the default interpolation mode is linear, not hold. You can also create a keyframe with the correct default interpolation mode by double-clicking the envelope. If you do create a keyframe using the context menu Add Keyframe option and you want linear interpolation, there's no need to delete it and create a new one. You can simply change the interpolation mode to linear using the right-click context menu, which I'll deal with shortly. Now that I've pointed out the bug and explained workarounds, I'll move on. The track header effects list hierarchy depends upon the position of the effects in the event's effects chain. For example, with the first event, the list is video stabilization, black and white, then Gaussian blur. If I move the Gaussian blur tab to before the black and white tab, you'll see the track header list change to reflect this change. Another thing to be aware of is that only one effect animation envelope can be displayed for each event. If the second effect envelope is opened for the first event using the chevrons icon, the second effect envelope will open for the second event. Referring to the second event now, unlike the black and white effect of the first event, the light flares effect of the second event has three animated parameters, shown by the indented labels under the lens flare label. Keyframes are added to these parameter envelopes as explained earlier. To make the procedure easier, parameter envelopes not being worked on can be hidden by clicking the relevant Hide Envelope icon in the track header. As well as the right-click context menu for keyframes, there's another right-click context menu. Place the mouse over the second event parameter envelopes where you want to add a keyframe. Right-click to expose this other context menu and select Add Point. This adds a keyframe to all the parameter envelopes. Note that this method isn't affected by the interpolation mode bug I explained earlier. I'll just go through the few options in this context menu. The top entry is the effect. I've just talked about the second entry. The next entries are the animated parameter names, in this case 3. The checkboxes allow the relevant envelopes to be hidden. The Reset option removes all keyframes, so be careful with this one. There's no confirmation prompt, but the Undo function brings them back. The Delete option deletes the effect from the effects chain. Again, no confirmation prompt, but Undo reinstates it. One more thing. Although the track keyframe controller for an effect that's been collapsed is hidden, the keyframes will show in that collapsed track. These can still be manipulated to a certain extent. They can be moved along the timeline by dragging with the mouse. The timeline position and parameter value are displayed when the mouse is over the keyframe and while it's being dragged. You can also change its value by right-clicking it and selecting Set To. The context menu will then disappear and a value field will be displayed where you can change the parameter value at that keyframe. Now let's look at that keyframe right-click context menu. I'll use the black and white effect for simplicity, as it has only one parameter envelope. The top two are self-explanatory, and I've dealt with the third. The next 6 are the keyframes interpolation modes, and I've dealt with those in tutorial 126. The difference between these and those shown in the Effect UI keyframe controller is that these show you how the mode will affect the envelope. The next 2 apply Bezier curves to the keyframe. I explained how Bezier handles, sometimes called tangents, work in tutorial 126, but I'll go through it again here. I'm going to select Reset All so I can start with a clean envelope. There are 2 modes for Bezier curves: locked tangents and split tangents. I'm going to add 2 keyframes to the envelope. I'll use the Add Keyframe icon to avoid the interpolation mode bug I mentioned earlier. I'll now add a Bezier curve with locked tangents to the first keyframe. The first thing to note is that the second keyframe has acquired a Bezier handle, even though I didn't apply one. This is because the first keyframe has initiated a curve, so the second keyframe must complete it. Hence, it acquires a Bezier handle. The second thing to note is that they both have only one Bezier handle. This is because of a simple rule. For a keyframe to have 2 Bezier handles, the keyframes at either side of it must have Bezier handles applied. I'm now going to add a third keyframe. Now the second keyframe has acquired a second Bezier handle, and because of this, the third keyframe has acquired a single handle to complete the curve. If I add another keyframe, that one will acquire a single handle, and the one before it will acquire a second one. The small circles at the end of the Bezier handles are referred to as nodes, or sometimes points. The curves are manipulated by adjusting these nodes. You'll notice that as I adjust a node on a keyframe that has 2 Bezier handles, the node opposite the one I adjust moves equally in the opposite direction. This is because I chose to add the Bezier curve locked tangents option. The handles are locked together. I'll change one of these to the split tangent option. Now when I move one node, the other doesn't move. Another thing to note, I can't move a node horizontally beyond its own keyframe or horizontally beyond its adjacent keyframe. Now onto the next context menu option. I'll move to the next event for this. The Flip All Points option simply negates the value of all the keyframes belonging to that parameter. Although why you would want to do this puzzles me. However, if part of the timeline is selected and the context menu is opened for a particular parameter keyframe, the Flip All Points option changes to Flip Selected Points. Only keyframes belonging to that particular keyframe parameter and are also contained within the selected area will have their values negated. This works if I open the context menu for a keyframe outside the selected area. If this parameter has a keyframe within the selected area, that keyframe will be flipped. There may be occasions when this may be useful. The next option is Thin All Points, or if a selection is made, the option changes to Thin Selected Points. This option is solely intended for automatically created envelopes and has no effect on manually created envelopes. The next option is Reset All. Selecting this will delete all keyframes and set the envelope to its default value. The final option deletes the keyframe. Note that if the keyframe is part of a pair, such as a location keyframe, its partner will be deleted also. Now for some useful hints for things that may not be obvious. When you adjust an envelope with the mouse, it may seem hit and miss. The secret is to hover the mouse over the envelope until you see a hand pointing a finger. Now press and hold the left button. If you see a vertical double-headed arrow, you can then move the envelope. Hovering the mouse over an envelope will display a label indicating the effect and parameter for that envelope. Hovering the mouse over a keyframe will display a label indicating the effect, parameter, keyframe timeline position, and parameter value at that keyframe. I apologise if this tutorial is perceived as being too long. However, I think you'll agree that there was a lot to get through on this subject. As this series caters solely for the Vegas Pro beginner, It was important that I delivered it in a slow, methodical manner. Anyway, as you've got this far, thanks for staying with me. If you've found these tutorials useful, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. Until the next one, bye for now.